ArcServe is the pioneer in data resilience solutions. For over 40 years, nearly 150,000 customers and over 30,000 channel partners spanning the globe have trusted ArcServe to strengthen their data resilience, recover lost assets, and ensure business continuity. With a unified approach to data protection, world-class technical support, and the lowest total cost of ownership, ArcServe helps businesses manage, defend, and most importantly, recover their data from any situation. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Massey, and I'm the America's VP of Sales for ArcServe. Thank you so much for attending our inaugural segment of Beyond the Arc. And today we're talking about not all data is equal. This talk will not be any type of sales pitch, but rather it will be a discussion on industry trends and the effect it has on our customers and our partners. Today I have as my guest, Aftab Alam. Aftab is the Chief Product Officer for ArcServe. Welcome, Aftab. It's terrific to have you here today.
Thanks, Sean. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to having an interesting discussion with you.
Aftab, according to Statista, data created, captured, and stored rose to 120 zettabytes in 2023. Further, they predict that this will increase to nearly 200 zettabytes by the end of 2025. In your view, what kind of challenges does this pose for organizations?
It's an interesting question, and one that I'm actually going to start by sort of grounding folks that, in our estimation, things are an acceleration of where things are already. It's sort of more of the same. Data has been exploding for years, and to date, corporate IT has adapted in terms of dealing with that data, figuring out data resilience strategies, and making sure that they meet the SLAs, SLOs that they have with their businesses. Most customers have a existing rich and multi-layered approach to data resiliency that they've honed over many, many years. Now, one of the things that's changing, implicit in my answer, is that the velocity of data growth is increasing at an ever increasing rate. It's sort of like an exponential function more than a linear function. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. There are sensors, there's sort of the data being used to train AI models, or the AI models themselves. And then storage is, relatively cheap. Now, I don't think it's ever as cheap as you think it is, but storage is cheap. So the challenge that folks that I talk to are having is, making sense of all of the data, deciding what to do with it, and then sort of disposing it in the right places. And one of the common themes that I talk about a lot when I talk to customers is really around data governance and kind of how you manage that data as it flows through your systems. And then, recently, over the last year to 18 months, there's been an increase in the number of customers that are sort of really thinking through how to deal with malicious actors and fine-tuning their data protection posture, given all of the data and the sort of, every company is a digital company. That's sort of been a mantra for years. But now more than ever, if your data is not available, your ability to do business is severely impacted.
Wow. Yeah, given that, with the advent and buzz of generative AI, what kind of impact do you think Gen AI will have to data consumption first? And also, there seems to be a concern about potential Gen AI supply chain attacks. Can you tell us what that is and what are the risks?
Sure. Look, we're in the early stages of generative AI, and I think we should ground this part of the conversation around that. There's a lot of there are a lot more questions around what generative AI will mean for companies than there are answers today. I think there are a lot of companies that are experimenting, but in terms of real world sort of deep applications, you're starting to see a few Copilot for Microsoft being sort of notable for being out there. ChatGPT obviously is out there as well, but it's still early days. So I want to ground this part of the conversation around with that in mind. So you start your first part of your question is kind of like what's happening with the data. So what we're seeing is that there's a lot of data being used for training. The models are becoming bigger, and one of the questions that we sort of collectively have to work through is which pieces of that data need to be protected. What pieces of that data, what parts of that model does a company need to treat as um, uh, critical business assets that need to have sort of the top tier recovery point objective. And that answer is still very much in flux. I think that as people understand that models can be trained relatively quickly, especially with sort of pre-canned models that are now coming out from major AI vendors that you can sort of add additional sort of domain-specific knowledge on top of, what you're seeing is that you may not need to back up or may not need to have a incredibly atomic RPO for the model that you've produced. Now, the source data may be really important because even if you're using a pre-canned model, the domain-specific layer that you add on top of it, you may need all of that data to do. And so that's sort of like the first part, which is like, how do we think about the data? Data is exploding, and this sort of goes back to the theme of the conversation that we're having today. Is all of that data equally valuable? And maybe the model isn't as valuable as the source data. Maybe the model is more valuable than the source data. I think that some of that's going to be very domain specific. Now, the second part of your question starts to get into the theoretical, but it's a very interesting thing for us to think about, which is over the last, I'd say, 3 years, we've started to see supply chain attacks on libraries, code libraries, where people have injected upstream malicious actions in that code. And it's actually been very hard for the industry to think about how to respond to that. And you're starting to see much more hygiene around sort of that supply chain. If you think about your AI and generative AI of having a supply chain where the supply chain is really around data, you start to really have to think about how do you protect the source data that you use to train your model. Now, some of that will be handled by the large AI companies because they have an incredibly vested economic interest in making sure that their models are clean. But as you add your domain specific intelligence on top of that, you're going to need to make sure that the data that you're using to train that or refine that model is clean, hasn't been manipulated by malicious actors, and that's going to be something that is a little bit of a theoretical side for now, but I'd encourage folks to start to think about that early, given the pressures that people will start to have when it comes to cybersecurity. One of the things that I heard recently at a conference I was at is just assume that your network has been compromised, and kind of how would you change what you're doing if you assume your network is compromised? And I think that advice is equally valid with generative AI models as it is about anything else, because if I can manipulate your data, I can sort of change the outputs of your model.
I mean, no doubt. And in fact, I was just reading about a New York attorney back in January that was fined because the appeal documents that he had done, he had used AI in order to prepare that, didn't fact check, and it referenced a case that didn't even exist. So certainly we have to make sure that we're validating that data. So now I'm going to put my data resilience hat on, what type of tactical steps should a business and organizations take in order to protect their data?
Sure. Let's let's take a step back from generative AI. I know it's the hot buzzword these days, but I think it's worthwhile for us to think about the more mundane data, sort of as a domain that corporate IT departments all need to think about how to manage and how to dispose of properly. Whether that is we don't care about it, or it's super critical to our business, and we have governance requirements that require us to keep that data around for 7 years, let's say. And so what you wind up with is in that world, you sort of need to reinforce that not all data is created equal. Some data is going to be more valuable than other pieces of data. And as you think about your data resilience strategy, you need to start to refine what it is you're trying to do and what your business objectives are. So really start from scratch. One of the first conversations I have with customers is, look, we don't care if you're using our software to back up your environment, but please make sure you're using something to back up your environment. And on top of that, make sure you understand what you're backing up. Your ERP data is going to be more valuable than log data from web servers. Both may need to be backed up for a variety of reasons, but understand that your ERP data probably has a very low recovery point objective, a very low recovery time objective, but you also want to make sure that you have multiple copies of the backup of that data backed up in various places. For your log data, you may just want to have like what I call a hot backup, which is sort of just to another disk on another server, so that if that server goes down, you have another copy. And that may be sufficient for what your business is looking to do. So I think that the data explosion just reinforces that you have to constantly vet and groom what you are backing up and making sure that you are meeting the business objectives that you have for the data and the criticality of that data to your business's continuity.
Great. So really you're kind of talking about, identifying low value data versus high value data, and doing that. How does an organization go about determining that?
It's an interesting exercise because every company will have a different answer. And one of the best ways I've experienced to sort of start to do that categorization is to do what the industry calls a red table exercise. And you don't have to, it's not a very fancy thing. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it. You don't have to get outside consultants to come in, but it's really, spend time as a leadership team in your company saying, okay, if we lose this data, what happens to our business? And the more valuable the data, sort of that's going to be sort of very apparent very quickly, and sort of run through your business systems and constantly groom that list. As you come up with new projects, it's worthwhile doing that red table exercise for a project. And it can be done very quickly. Again, you want to assume that your network has been compromised. And so in that world, okay, like if we were to lose access to a piece of data, could we manage the business without it, or would the business grind to a halt until we could restore that data or rehydrate sort of that information from other sources? And so every business will have a different answer. The best way I've experienced is to do sort of it's almost like a game, right? A red table game where you sort of say, okay, if this data is compromised, what's the impact to my business? And then you'll naturally start to form a hierarchy of data sort of criticality for your specific business.
So great. I mean, that gives a really good background as we look at that. When we now look at it through that lens of a data resilience strategy, how would organizations go about protecting, the high value and low value data appropriately?
Sure. And this is where it becomes, the rubber meets the proverbial road. In an ideal world, you'd back it all up. You'd have a budget to kind of back up everything, high value, low value. You wouldn't make that distinction. You'd basically have an unlimited budget and sort of an unlimited IT environment, and you'd be able to back up everything. But that's a lot. And you probably can't do that for every application that you have. So again, the red table exercise starts to get into kind of how to do that segmentation. But then I kind of want people to start to think about the kind of going back to the basics. For critical data, you want to make sure you have 3 copies of that data in 2 different media formats, with 1 copy off-site and 1 copy air-gapped, right? That's a lot. 3, 2, 1, 1. That's a lot of sort of redundancy that you're building in, and sort of your costs will go up as a result of that. On the other hand, for those weblogs that I'm talking about, maybe you only need 2 copies of that data, right? So you start to basically say, okay, fine, like it's a lot of work to get started. And again, this is sort of the bread and butter, I think, of a data resiliency strategy is to do your homework, to start to do that segmentation of your application set, and start to say, okay, which pieces of data need to have that 3, 2, 1, 1 highly available, sort of like I could lose a primary site for some reason, and I could still rehydrate my environment relatively quickly because I have an air gap copy, and maybe it takes a while to get that air gap copy back to an environment where I can restore from, but I can do it. Versus data that's low value, where you basically only keep 2 copies of data, and if you lose it, it's okay. Like I was recently reading about a geospatial company, and basically, they're sort of looking at things down to the meter, but they're saying, hey, look, if we lose a little bit of GPS data, it's okay, because generally speaking, like the atomicity that we have is, let's say every other second, and if we only get data for every 10 seconds, that's okay. So again, that's a decision that they made for their business, and I think that every IT department needs to do that for their application set, because there isn't a hard and fast rule that will apply to everyone. The best I can say is that the most valuable data should be protected and ultimately air gapped, to prevent malicious actors from modifying it.
I'm going to pivot a little bit. So to some folks, tape backup has long been declared dead, while others continue to use it in certain situations and for compliance. Is tape necessary in this day and age?
Yes, I think tape is very well. So, I say yes as sort of flippantly, but tape represents a class of storage of write once, read many times, and so you can basically say there's tape, there's optical drives, and there's sort of like air-gapped servers. Though air-gapped servers are a little hard to think about, but companies use truly air-gapped networks and have servers built in. I mean, in the military and the government, that's kind of a common deployment modality. And I think that tape is a mechanism to achieve that air gapping. And it is a mechanism with high capacity, relatively low costs, reasonably durable, and the ability to move off-site very quickly, right? So basically take your tape out of your tape drive, and then you can ship it to your off-site provider of choice. But there are other ways of achieving the same results. And so instead of, I think, folks sort of over-indexing to the media, think of it as air gapping is incredibly important, and you have a continuum of choices. What I call hot backups, which is kind of like backups on another server, but in the same data center, using backup software. So they're compressed, they're dehydrated, and you can sort of recover over time. To immutable storage, which again is in the data center, but is much harder to delete, and then all the way to air gapped. And so as you think about your business continuum and your business requirements, various pieces of your IT estate will fall into various buckets. And some of them, maybe due to regulatory requirements, maybe due to sort of business requirements, will fall into the air gap category. And in that case, tape is a great mechanism and media to achieve kind of the long-term archival needs that businesses have.
That's an excellent point. Um, I'm just going to have one more question here, so we can kind of wrap it up. So we've talked certainly about the vast storage data explosion that we're experiencing right now. Is there a 40,000 foot call to action that you would suggest for people on approaching their data protection?
This is going to sound weird, but be ruthless in what you choose to back up. Like if you start with you kind of have two different ways of looking at the world. I mean, I'm sort of oversimplifying, but you have the approach where you say, I'm going to back up everything and I have to sort of decide what not to back up. And that sort of leads down a road where you're going to be backing up a ton of data. Or you can start with, hey, look, I'm not going to back up anything, but I'm going to sort of go through my systems one by one and decide what I need to back up and kind of what the criticality of that information is and that data is and that application is, and then decide on the right backup strategy for that particular application. The second approach is actually much harder because you actually have to go through your entire IT estate and you kind of have to keep that list fairly well up to date. But I would argue that it gets you better results. Like it basically makes sure that you are not only minimizing the size of the backups that you have, but you are staying on top of what matters to the business. And the other thing that I'd say is, backing up is only part of um, the journey that a company needs to go through. It's really important to restore that data on some frequency. I would argue for your most important data, up to once a month is reasonable. But at least every few months, you should restore that data to an environment where you can make sure that you have the fidelity of data that you need. It's kind of two sides of the same coin. And most companies that have a BCDR plan have sort of the restore part of the equation thought about as well. But from a 40,000 foot view, be ruthless in what you back up. Back up. So, that's really important. And then restore. And then the last thing I'll say, which has come up much more frequently, is don't assume that your SaaS vendors are backing up your data. They may, but their SLAs in terms of their recovery points for SaaS things like Microsoft 365, Salesforce, Google Workspace may not be what you want. And so you should really think about including those SaaS applications in your backup environments as well, or your backup policies as well. So it's a really rich space, and I've today only scratched the surface, but just make sure you're backing up and restoring is kind of the thing that I'd love to make sure that everyone leaves this conversation with.
Excellent. This is great stuff, Aftab, and it seems like a good stopping point for today. I thank you wholeheartedly for your time and your thoughtful conversation. And for all those that have tuned in, thank you too for your time and keeping out for future Beyond the Arc conversations. So goodbye for now. Protect what's priceless. And remember, data resilience doesn't just happen.